there's been a lot of discussion of the end of the Cold War, although of course one could argue that there is a new Cold War that we're already in the midst of. But with the death of Gorbachev, there's been a lot of discussion about how great it was that the Cold War ended. What are your thoughts on the end of the Cold War? I mean, is it just a foregone conclusion that that was a good thing?
Well, I'm not as young as I look, by the way. And so in 1988, you can look it up. In fact, I quoted in my book on Southern Africa. This is during the height of Gorby Mania. I wrote a piece for The Guardian of New York City, which is now defunct New York Radical Weekly,
Mm,
where I pointed out that the deal that was emerging between Washington and Moscow was an end to these so-called regional conflicts. What that meant was pulling the plug on the forces that the then Soviet Union were supporting fighting apartheid in South Africa. As I also point out in that book on Southern Africa, it's no accident that the last apartheid leader, F.W. de Klerk, chooses to negotiate with Nelson Mandela weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because he recognized that with the African National Congress's main ally withdrawing from the battlefield, that the ANC would be disadvantaged. And you could make an argument that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 3 years before democratic elections in South Africa, taking place in 1994, has left the ANC handicapped to this very day. It's only a country with a mid-sized economy, a population of less than 60 million, and yet it's had to face not only the domestic allies of Washington, but the North Atlantic Bloc generally. So I'm afraid to say that I was not necessarily one who was celebrating Gorby Mania, although, once again, I regret his passing, as
sure.
I regret the passing of any human being. This crisis in Ukraine may be spinning out of control, particularly in light of this successful counteroffensive. I think that it may inflate the expectations in Washington. It may put wind in the sails of the warmongers who might decide that the time has come to execute a plan that has been on the table in Europe for centuries. And by the way, I wrote about this a few days after February 24th, 2022, on the website of the Black Agenda Report. What I mean, and this will really connect our two discussions, is that if you look at the map of Europe, most of Europe is Russian territory. Russia's population of about 150 million is almost twice that of Germany. When the Western European nations led by Britain were getting fat on the plunder of Africa and the Americas, London was moving east across Asia, establishing Vladivostok, its window on the Pacific, in 1860. And so as a result, Europe was out of balance, in the sense that these major world powers were not necessarily a major power in their own backyard. That led to Napoleon's invasion 200 years ago. You could make an argument that it led to Hitler's invasion about 80 years ago. And so now the plan is finally to resolve the Russia question, to overthrow the regime, divide up the country. It wasn't enough to divide up the Soviet Union. Now the time has come, it is thought, to divide up Russia. And then these Western European nations could take advantage of all the resources, the titanium, the natural gas, the oil. Otherwise, they'll find themselves dependent upon natural gas from Algeria, which is not forgotten the war inflicted by France, only ending with independence in 1962, or they'll be dependent upon the petroleum from Angola, which is not forgotten the NATO US sponsored war before independence, and actually after independence in 1975. So the Western European nations and their backers in Washington have a real dilemma now with this conflict. And they may decide to go for a riverboat gamble, but with this tightening relation between Beijing and Moscow, this riverboat gamble could explode in their faces.